This is Insider Itinerary. I'm Seth Kaplan. So glad you're with us once again this week. A lot to talk about this week. I want to start with something that's rather serious, at least the allegations we read in a story this week. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal Monday morning. Toxic fumes leaking into airplanes. And three reporters from the Wall Street Journal worked for a long time on this story, reviewed, they said, millions of records, and found that occasionally, very occasionally, when we smell something funny inside an airplane, it could be harmful, and very, very occasionally, very harmful. Now, we're going to get to all the details later, but they talked to the aircraft manufacturers involved here who said that their aircraft meet and exceed all kinds of airworthiness standards. They talked to the airlines involved here who said the same thing. But according to the journal's analysis, air that flows into airplanes, which generally is this air at high altitude, very fresh air, and then the air is pressurized. But because on most aircraft it flows through aircraft engines before it gets into the airplane, well, if there is some kind of a leak in the engine, then possibly whatever is leaking could become vaporized and could make it into the cabin as well. Much more on that coming up in the second part of Insider Itinerary. First, I want to switch from planes to trains for a minute and talk about what used to be called Rail Safety Week, but now they've sort of they've left even less to the imagination, and they are now calling it See Tracks, Think Train. So this is what's going on this week, and I'll show you here this website. There you see Tracks, Think Train, and clearly they thought that Rail Safety Week wasn't obvious enough. And you think, don't people know not to stop on railroad tracks? But here's the thing. You see there, more than 2,000 people injured or killed on railroad tracks each year in America. There's an accident on a railroad track every 3 hours in America. So this is a topic that no matter how much we talk about it, people do apparently have to be reminded of. But if you're wondering, and I know I've sometimes thought, well, I bet most of this happens on kind of those usually rural or little used uncontrolled crossings where there's no crossing gate and all the rest of it. The folks who run this program say no. They say 60% of the accidents happen where there are crossing gates. And so lots to think about. But the main thing is, just because traffic's moving and the car in front of you is moving and you think you'll, of course, be able to get across the railroad tracks, you just never want to start going onto a railroad track before you have enough space on the other side of the tracks to get completely across it and then leave enough margin, keeping in mind that, of course, the tracks are more narrow than the train itself. So it's all about leaving lots of margin for error, of course, not trying to beat the crossing arms when they come down and all the rest of it. In a lot of cases, property damage, minor injuries, but people do die every year accidentally because of what happens on railroad tracks. So again, not just Railroad Safety Week, See Tracks, Think Train, and a special reminder this week because that's the focus. Moving back to the airline industry, and this isn't exactly the airline industry, but something we've all been hearing a lot about this past week. I'm talking about the shooting death of Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist who there you see in file video from the past. And we know that on social media and elsewhere, there have been all kinds of reactions to his death, a lot of people mourning him, some people expressing other kinds of emotions. And where does this intersect with the airline industry? Well, just like in every other industry, these companies have employees who have expressed themselves. And in some cases, airlines like United, you saw Delta there, you saw American, those are the three biggest airlines in America, but they're not the only ones, have suspended employees, including pilots, for example, for saying things that these companies felt went beyond what was within the bounds of sort of free expression in terms of people saying that they disagreed with what Charlie Kirk stood for, and expressing kind of various degrees of being okay with what happened. And a useful reminder for all of us that, of course, free speech is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, but employers can restrict what their employees say online. And a reminder, too, that everyone has different definitions here of what's acceptable and what's not, right? There's a range. I mean, there are people who said things that were clearly on one extreme, obviously people who were extremely distraught about what happened, other people who expressed basically satisfaction with what happened, but in between, people who pointed out that they disagreed with what Charlie Kirk stood for, and somewhere between those and the comments that almost everybody agreed were inappropriate was this line that companies were drawing here and saying, you know, we don't want, in the case of airlines, our pilots and flight attendants, customer-facing employees saying those things. And so again, nothing specific to the airline industry, but something that's playing out in all of America. And airlines are one of the most labor-intensive industries. In other words, it takes a lot more employees to produce what airlines produce than it does other big companies. You think of a company like, you know, like Alphabet, which owns Google, or Meta, which owns Facebook. Those are huge companies that have relatively few employees. Technology companies. Airlines, an airline like American Airlines has something like 120,000 employees. And so that's one reason you tend to hear more about the actions of airline employees than you do about the employees of other companies, because there are so many more airline employees than there are employees of even other very large and influential companies that we hear about. I want to talk now about Southwest Airlines, the other giant U.S. airline. It's not a global airline like American, United, and Delta, but by some measures, it's one of the very biggest domestic airlines. And Southwest, lately, we've been talking about them charging for things that used to be free, right? Charging for checked bags, for example. Charging for seat assignments, whereas you used to just be able to go on and grab whatever seat you wanted. Now, if you want a special seat, you have to pay extra for the special seat. But it's not all bad news. Southwest is now going to make something free that has already been free on other airlines. I'm talking about Wi-Fi. Okay, so JetBlue was the first exception to the idea of charging for Wi-Fi. It's basically always been free, at least up to a certain speed on JetBlue. Delta, among the giant airlines, was the first to say it would make Wi-Fi free on most of its aircraft. And more recently, American and United have done the same thing. But Southwest kept charging. It was last time I was on a Southwest plan, it was $8 if you wanted Wi-Fi. That is now going away. So Southwest charging for bags, charging for seat assignments, doing all those things that people don't like at other airlines, but making the Wi-Fi free. So this has been something that went from kind of an extra, something that was seen as a luxury, kind of like in other areas of our life, right? Those of us who are old enough to remember when Wi-Fi was new, we were excited a few decades ago if we would show up somewhere and there was Wi-Fi available, and we would expect maybe to have to pay for it in a hotel or in an airport or somewhere like that. And then it just sort of became an expectation. And now here we have the latest airline among the giant ones to say, you know, it's not going to be a source of what airlines call ancillary revenue, right? Extra money, but just kind of a brand promise. And this will take some time before it's rolled out, but it's going to start rolling out at Southwest here soon as it continues rolling out at those other airlines. JetBlue is the only one that it's absolutely free on every flight. The others are still upgrading their equipment, and you might get on certain aircraft and still be asked to pay, whereas it's free on others. Usually when you're asked to pay, it's such an old, slow system with limited bandwidth that if they made it free on that airplane for everybody, it wouldn't work because there's just not enough bandwidth between there and the ground. Speaking of airports, I found this next story from our friends at KSWB in San Diego fun, because have you ever been to a busy aircraft terminal full of all these people doing all the things that people do in aircraft terminal and clearing security, all the rest of it, but nobody was traveling anywhere? that is what happened in San Diego this week.
And all these people you see behind me, they're not really going anywhere today, but they're going through a simulation here at the brand new Terminal 1. It's something the airport's doing to get feedback for when this is up and running. It's almost ready. The new Terminal 1 at San Diego International Airport is just days away from welcoming its first passengers.
We're taking Sun Country Airlines to Los Cabos.
But before that, people like Leanne Bartlett are getting an exclusive look at the new terminal. The airport hosting a community reveal open house, allowing family and friends to get a sneak peek.
But I took the transit bus and it was easy. It dropped me off though at the old terminal, so I had to walk to the parking lot to get here. But no, it was easy, and TSA was fine.
Visitors are going through an organized simulation along with a self-guided tour of the terminal, being the first ones to see the modern design, spacious layouts, and new concessions offering complimentary samples.
I like the high ceilings, and we're going to go and check out the outdoor patio, which they don't offer that at other places. And it just looks like it's going to be really accommodating.
The airport's saying this is a way to get feedback for when the terminal opens.
If you've ever been in the old or the existing Terminal 1, you may have experienced that it was very cramped. The major difference is that in the new Terminal 1, it's very expansive. There's much more room in the gate areas.
The new terminal will be fully operational come September 23rd, and passengers can't wait.
March, I'm going on a cruise to the Caribbean.
Reporting at San Diego International Airport, I'm Wiley Jahari.
All right, Wiley, thank you. One thing, by the way, it's interesting about San Diego is that the airport, even though they have this beautiful new terminal, they still have just the same old runway that they've always had. And sometimes when cities build new airport terminals, occasionally they also build just a new airport somewhere farther out, and they can build as many runways as they want. Denver did that, for example, years ago. In the case of San Diego, it's both a good thing and a bad thing. This is still the same old airport complex itself, and it is one of the busiest single runway airports in the world. And the reason there's only one runway is that that's all that fits there. They still use this same runway, which when you go way back was like a lot of airports used for military purposes. And so the bad thing is they can't add runways, they can't expand capacity in that way, right? They can't, suddenly have twice as many flights because you can only have so many aircraft landing and taking off at one airport. But the neat thing about it is it's very centrally located. When you fly into San Diego, whereas other places, well, then you got a long trip into the city. San Diego, nope, the airport's right there at what was once the edge of town, but now very, very centrally located as the region has grown up around it. And until now, they also had that cramped old terminal, but not anymore. Coming up next on Insider Itinerary, I want to get back to what we started the show with, that discussion about toxic fumes inside aircraft. And we are speaking with somebody who now knows as much about this as just about anybody in the world when we come back. Welcome back to Insider Itinerary. I am Seth Kaplan, and I want to get immediately back to something that we started the show briefly with, but go into a lot more depth. We talked about those toxic fumes occasionally inside the cabins of aircraft, and I am joined by someone who is as good of a person in America to talk about this, because he is one of the 3 Wall Street Journal reporters who did an absolutely outstanding job on this story. John West. And John, when I opened up Monday morning's paper and I saw this story, I mean, look, I covered airlines full time for 13 years. So a lot of times I see something and I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting, but it's maybe, for somebody with a lack of perspective, overblown or not that. Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of stuff out there. This one really jumped out at me. And again, we'll emphasize that this is rare. That doesn't happen often. Air travel remains extraordinarily safe and all the rest of it. However, this is, well, let me start this portion of the show this way. Let me ask you, for everything that was in there, and folks should go read the article if they haven't, was there something that surprised even you I mean, obviously you embarked on this with your two colleagues because you thought there was a there. You didn't expect to find nothing, or you wouldn't have reviewed millions of records. But was there something that you found that you didn't anticipate to find when you started working on this story?
Yeah, and thank you. It's great to be here. The thing that was most surprising to me was the starkness of the increase beginning in 2017, and the way that that increase. I mean, it just goes up and up. And I mean, there's I should say during the pandemic some reporting kind of funkiness that means that the rates slightly decreased, but what you see overall is just this trend of up, 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 starting in 2017. Um, that really surprised me. Not because I doubted our reporting, which I should say, but but it surprised me because normally when I'm a data reporter, and when you do a data story like this, you expect to see some amount of weirdness and like, oh, the trend is pretty good but not perfect. We'll have to caveat and explain. With this trend, it was very clear. The numbers went up very high starting in about 2017.
And I'm glad that you happen to be the data reporter. And obviously, depending on which of the three of you I was talking with, I would have different. Andrew covers the industry commercially, very in all kinds of depth and so forth. But yeah, I do want to ask you, and you sort of in the article, you do acknowledge that look, there could be some increased awareness that could explain some of that. But are you, again, as a data person, are you pretty comfortable that and when folks look at the article, they'll see, it goes like this.
Yeah.
That goes beyond anything that could be explained by just sort of people paying more attention to this.
I do genuinely believe that the increase is driven by a real world phenomenon that goes beyond simply more reporting or more awareness of reports. Um, Part of the reason I think that is that if you look at the trends on the Boeing 737 family versus the Airbus A320 family, what you see is a real stark divergence where the A320 family pops right on up and the Boeing 737 has a slight increase, but not a real, you don't see the same starkness. And we looked at reports from the top three, kind of the largest three carriers that fly mixed fleets. So that means that we're not focusing on just say Spirit, which flies almost entirely Airbuses. So what that indicates to me,
JetBlue, you talk
or
a lot about,
JetBlue,
and
yeah,
JetBlue is mostly semi 190, but yeah,
yeah.
essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and so like by focusing on by one of the things we did to check the data was look at these mixed fleet carriers because in principle, at least, you would think, as I do, that if there's increased awareness, you would see it kind of evenly distributed across those fleets. Instead, what you see on those fleets is the A320 driving the increase as opposed to the Boeing 737, which increased a bit but stayed mostly flat.
Right. And I sort of did my own little kind of common sense check of, I know, as you mentioned in the article, the A320 is the most commonly ordered aircraft. And so it would surprise us that there are more reports of this aboard A320s than 737s, which for folks who don't know, those are comparable aircraft. And if you don't know airplanes, when you get on when you get on JetBlue, you're almost certainly on an A320. When you get on Southwest, you're certainly on a 737. They look a lot alike. Those are kind of it's Coke and Pepsi as far as short haul aircraft that fly these kind of 1, 2, 3,000 mile routes that a lot of people typically fly. Anyway, so I took a look at just the fleet data, what's out there. I used Cerium. There are other airline data sources, and there are more A320s flying than 737s, but it's not a lot more. It's something like a little over 9,000 A320s currently flying, and that's all variants, not just the new engine options. And 8,000 something 737s out there. So again, a little bit more A320s, but you wouldn't expect that differential that we saw there. Do you have any thought?
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
can I add to that? Which is just to say that we also looked at rates. So we weren't looking at just the raw numbers. We were actually looking at the rates over department of departures. So that means that the 737 rate was not increasing the way that the the Airbus A320 rate was increasing. And so by doing that rate, we're actually controlling a little bit for those discrepancies.
You controlled for all that as well. So, and I just kind of, and we should say here that, you spoke with both aircraft manufacturers. Both of them told you that they meet and exceed all airworthiness standards. You talked to all the airlines that you mentioned in the article. All of them essentially told you the same thing, that they meet and exceed all standards. Um, you do mention in the article that there's one kind of aircraft that any of us could really fly on nowadays that works differently, where you don't have the air. The way it works with most of these aircraft is the air sort of flows through the engines, bleed air, it's called, and typically it's this very clean air at altitude that flows through. But if there's some kind of a leak in the engine, then whatever's leaking could be sucked in and vaporized, and that could end up in fumes. And we should say, by the way, too, we've all been on an airplane where we smell something funny at some point, and it's almost certainly not this. Smelling something funny is common. This is rare. But having said all that, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner is the one plane that just works entirely differently. And I want to ask you, and I mean, I'm kind of leading the witness here because I have a theory here, but one thing I know about airplanes is that almost every other kind of airplane is sort of an evolution based on a really old airframe. The 737s go back to the 1960s. The A320s go back to the 1980s. The 787 Dreamliner was the one plane that, and this early on caused some problems for Boeing, but they basically, it's a clean sheet airplane. They basically started from scratch and made this. I mean, is that sort of the fundamentally what's going on here? Is that all these other aircraft families are sort of moving slowly beyond something that started many years ago?
Yeah, I mean, bleed air. So bleed air again is the mechanism by which many of these events happen. The air at altitude is not very dense, and so it needs to be compressed and then heated and then cooled. And so this whole process of getting the air from outside into the cabin, and about half the air you breathe is recirculated, so it's kind of coming through, and the other half is this bleed air. I think the one of the interesting things about what we saw with the Boeing 787 is that it wasn't in the data, right? So obviously because I was looking at the data, I didn't see a Boeing 787. I was like, this is weird. And I'm not an aviation guy, I should say. I don't know planes very well until this story. And I reached out to Ben and I was like, Ben, why is the 787 not in the data? And he had a very long explanation for exactly what you described, which is that the Boeing kind of went back to the drawing board on how to bring how to bring air into the cabin. One thing I should say is that the Airbus A320, one of the big problems with it is something called the APU, the auxiliary power unit, and it's a kind of engine, but it's not like the engine that drives the plane. It's a power unit that's in the back of the plane, and that also is a way that you can get air on the plane, and that oftentimes had hydraulic fluid or oil leaks in there, and that also drove some of the increase on the A320. So you see, like there are lots of different ways that hydraulic fluid or oil can get into an engine or power unit and then get sucked into the air conditioning system. And it's often kind of the leaks aren't intentional, but drawing the air through a power unit is definitely an engine is definitely on purpose, and it's actually kind of ingenious if you think about it, right? Like they're already compressing the air, like why not, right? It's one of those. I always think about in doing these kinds of stories, like trying to get into the head of the engineer and thinking, wow, that's actually really clever, but it had these unforeseen maybe problems that the original engineers might not have thought of, which is when there's a leak, it's going to vaporize and get into the air and potentially be quite toxic.
And you kind of answered my next question, but just to drill down a little bit more as far as why more of the A320 than the 737. And what's interesting
Mhm.
about all this, and again, we talk about sort of having to add on to old airframes. If we think back to the 737 MAX, which is Boeing's re-engineering of an older aircraft, they had, of course, tragic consequences, which your colleagues reported on extensively. We all did, where well, I mean, there were these two crashes where basically, I mean, long story short, as they tried to take the old aircraft and put new engines on it, some things went wrong, and the weight and balance of the aircraft was thrown off, and the whole thing, and those planes crashed, and the A320 just it was just kind of luck. The way the old one was built, it was easier to slap a new engine on the new A320 than it was the new 737. So both manufacturers have faced these kinds of things, and it sounds like in this case, for whatever reason, there's something about the A320, and you kind of explained maybe it's that APU and back. And I guess my question is it that? Is it clearly that? And then I guess, well, I want to ask you after where do we go from here, but I want to ask one question before I get to that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, it's hard to know from the data what exactly is driving the increase. Oftentimes, what you see in the SDRs, the service difficulty reports that are filed with the FAA, and those were the reports that kind of became the backbone of the story. In those service difficulty reports, they might indicate kind of the cause. Maybe but they also might not. And so, like, it's hard to totally pin down what is driving the increase in the rate on the A320. That said, our reporting does show a couple things. One is the APU, as mentioned, and the other is maintenance change kind of started making in 2017 that allowed basically less checking after a fume event. If it was mild, if it wasn't kind of like, well, let's just there was less maintenance that had to be done at that point, and that was something that we wrote about extensively in the story, was this idea that like Airbus at the request of JetBlue and others, but Airbus was kind of like, it's okay, like if the fume event is not that severe, if these certain criteria are met, you don't have to do kind of the full regime that we had you doing previously. And what we saw after was a huge jump in repeat occurrences. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the numbers went. I think it was something like 6 to 40 of repeat occurrence of planes that had occurrences within 30 days. So what you see is after this maintenance change, fume events are being driven more and more by the increase in fume events on the A320 is being driven more and more by repeat occurrences on those same aircraft. And so maybe the fume event was kind of mild and transient, which is something that would indicate that maybe you don't need to do this full regime of work up according to Airbus. And it's not to say they wouldn't inspect the plane or anything, but they're doing less than they would before. And as such, we see a corresponding increase in the repeat occurrences. Now, that is suggestive. It is not definitive. I'm not on these planes. I'm not an aircraft mechanic, so it's hard for me to know exactly what's driving it. But what I can say is around the same time that these maintenance rules were changed, you see a corresponding increase in repeat occurrences.
And what you report is that the change happened seemingly at the request of airline customers who said, "Come on, do we really have to take this plane out of service for 2 days?" And Airbus sort of agreed, according to your reporting rather, to this new procedure, which calls into question regulations because these are all commercial pressures. I mean, it's expensive to take an airplane out of service, and you reached out to both the FAA and its counterpart in Europe. It's called the ASA, and they didn't really comment on any of this. And again, sort of brings us back to the 737 MAX situation where there were these allegations, although every situation is of course different as details, but where basically maybe commercial pressures were causing operational issues that were dangerous. And I do want to say, the coup de grace in this article, to give away the end a little bit, but everybody should read it anyway, is, one of the people you spoke with was a pilot who, she ended up dying of issues that that her doctors believe came from one of these events. And that was the other thing I found interesting. This was not necessarily cumulative exposure over a long time. Like, some of what happened here was one plane, something seemed to go very wrong, and then somebody had some rather clear health impacts that their doctors at least believed were because of this.
I will say that well, two things to note. One is many times there were repeat occurrences before the kind of more spectacular occurrence, or I don't know what the right word is, more dramatic occurrence. So our reporting, we talked to some doctors. One of them mentioned that the repeat kind of low level exposure might predispose someone to sensitivity in the future, which is a common trait, I think, across a number of our the stories of people who are harmed, um, and those harms being linked to fume events. The other thing I want to mention is that the FAA, uh, they have on their website that these events are rare. They say they point to a study that says about 33 per million departures. That number is fuzzy. Ours disagree with the FAA's from that time. I believe it's IATA has had a report. A lobbying group had a report
Yeah,
from a member
IATA is
carrier.
the
IATA, yeah,
airline, the
yeah.
airline trade association, the airline body
Um,
globally. Yeah.
Yeah, had I think it was 800 per million. So I mean that's a vast difference. But also the FAA cites a different study in one of their reports that's something like 2.8. So you really see this wide variety of, and part of the problem is there isn't a kind of agreed upon definition of what a fume event is, and there isn't measurement on board planes to detect when they happen. And so we're reliant on the noses of flight attendants and pilots, and we're reliant on the maintenance reports that come after. But all that together, it makes it a very fuzzy kind of thing to study. What we can say is that our analysis, which used the same definition of fume report every year, showed an increase in 2017 that skyrocketed, really. I mean, it went from I think 12 to 108 between 2010 and 2024. So what you see is like a really big jump there. Now the FAA also has released guidance in November of last year, I believe it was November, saying kind of like, if you are reporting a fume event, please give us more detail. And they tout that. They also mentioned that they are responding to legislation from Congress and fulfilling their legal obligations. I don't want to get out over my skis on what the FAA does or doesn't know, but what I will say is that we are reliant on FAA data to do our analysis. The data is public; it is out there. It is possible to sift through it and find what we found.
And just to sort of state the numbers a different way in case they're easier to grasp for people. I know in the article you mentioned that 33 per million translates to about 300 incidents per year if you rely on their count. So that would be a little less than one per day. Based on your count of the same reports, it's about twice that. So it would be roughly 600 per year, roughly two of these every day. And again, it's not to say that these would all cause necessarily some kind of serious injury or death, but things that would meet that standard of being reported.
That's right. And just to mention, the FAA looked at everything. We limited our analysis. We started looking at everything. And then we limited our analysis to the top carriers and the top makers, which cuts out like Cessnas and Bombardiers and planes like that. And so we're looking at big commercial jetliners, which are responsible for most of the seats that you see, like most people flying around. And so our numbers are slightly different, right? Because like while we had double the kind of number of fume events in raw numbers, in rate, our rate was much higher than 33. It was almost three times as much, so or more than three times as much. So it's double to three times. It's kind of confusing the way you can cut the data and slice it. But the point remains: the FAA number, based on a 2015 report, is much lower, both in real terms and in terms of rates, than what we found.
Right. Because the point is if we just look at like the number of flights, there are all kinds of flights that are not on airlines that don't carry very many people. I think you said you looked at the top 15 airlines, if I'm not mistaken, which carry well in excess of 99% of all of us. I mean, we if we're flying, we are almost certainly flying on one of those airlines, even though there are all kinds of flights that happen all the time with one or two people on them, or four people, or what have you, that are not commercial airline flights. John, what are you personally hoping comes of all this? I mean, we've seen in the past journalism lead to changes. What's yeah, what would you like to be reporting a year from now or 2 years from now after there's enough time to look at some new data?
Yeah, I mean, I think every reporter wants to see their work make real world impact. And something I would love to see is increased attention, both from regulators, but also Congress. And not to say that regulators and Congress aren't paying someone some attention, but I think this issue is very serious. It is a growing problem, and it deserves attention from relevant parties, airlines, manufacturers, regulators, and Congress. And I think to get really specific, I hope that people feel comfortable talking about these issues more. I think there's been a kind of uh, we report a pilot who was bullied for bringing up what happened to him, and I think that kind of culture of fear and not sure and we need more study and kind of this we're very qualifying the kind of the problem and making it hard to get at what's really going on. I think is an issue that I hope that our reporting helps solve.
Yeah. Has the regulatory environment changed in any way that might make that more difficult? And I ask because under uh, with the Trump administration and folks who they've appointed, we've seen in other ways airlines have gotten what they wanted and couldn't get under the Biden administration. I'm talking about consumer protections, for example. But that's something where reasonable people can disagree over whether an airline should have to automatically refund somebody because their Wi-Fi wasn't fast enough or something. But that's not dangerous. That's just money. This is something that's potentially dangerous. Is that something where you have any read on whether it's less likely for something to happen in this environment than there would have been a year ago?
I try not to make predictions and frankly I'm not an expert on the regulatory environment for kind of the airlines at large or how the political climate is impacting that. What I can say is that we have seen bipartisan efforts in Congress to tackle this issue. We have seen I guess kind of what I'm pointing to with that bipartisan thing is it doesn't seem to me to map neatly onto a partisan political divide. I'm not a prognosticator or a pundit, but it does seem to me that the bipartisan nature of some of the bills and interests from Congress indicates that maybe this isn't really a partisan issue and it's something that kind of transcends that.
Well, as you said, everybody has their role in this process. You and your two colleagues have certainly done yours. So, John West, thank you for what you did, and thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're Insider Itinerary right after this. And that is all the time we have. Actually, more time than we have. We went long this time because just fascinating stuff to discuss there. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. Again, in the broader context that, look, flying is extraordinarily safe. Anybody who says, I'm not going to fly there, I'm going to drive 1,000 miles instead to avoid any of these risks from flying, that's a poor assessment of risk. That said, look, in the past, problems have led to flying becoming even safer, and so you would hope that this is one of those instances where here's this risk that maybe a lot of us didn't really think a whole lot about in terms of the potential for toxic fumes in cockpits and aircraft cabins. That'll get a closer look now. Thanks so much for taking the time with us. We will be back next week. Until then, travel safely.